The stranger bride steps off the wagon. The wind carried the smell of dust and horses through the tiny frontier town. The kind of wind that rattled old shutters and stirred the grit under boot heels until everything seemed to wear a coat of brown. Jackson Cole stood near the weathered hitching post outside the stage stop, one gloved hand resting against the worn leather of his gun belt, though he wasn't there to draw a weapon. He was waiting. He'd been waiting for months, in truth. Waiting. On the stagecoach that carried the woman who'd answered his letter. The woman who had agreed to marry a man she had never met. The last thing Jackson had expected after so many years of silence and solitude was to find himself standing in town like a nervous boy, checking the sun's angle and listening for the distant rattle of wagon wheels. The little town of Dry Creek was alive that afternoon, though alive was a generous word. Its single dirt road was dotted with the occasional rider, a few wagons, and merchants leaning in their doorframes, watching the world pass by. Most eyes drifted toward Jackson. He was hard to miss, not for his height or build, but because of the way he carried himself. The old scar across his cheekbone caught the light, a pale reminder of a cattle raid gone wrong, and his hat brim cast a shadow that made him look meaner than he was. Folks in town were used to seeing him ride in for supplies and leave without a word, his horse kicking up dust on the way back to his lonely ranch. Today, however, was different. The loner rancher was standing still, boots planted, eyes fixed on the road. Even the shopkeeper's boy whispered about it. "Never thought I'd see Jackson Cole waiting for a woman," an old man muttered from his perch outside the saloon. His friend spat tobacco and chuckled. "Bet she's a pretty little thing, if she got him to come out here looking like that." Jackson ignored the murmurs. Truth was, he had no idea what to expect. The letters from Nora Brannigan had been kind, but brief. She had written in a tidy, practical hand, speaking of hard work and simple dreams. She'd been a cook for a traveling show, she said, but she longed for a quiet place to settle. She'd mentioned no family. She'd asked few questions about him, which had suited Jackson just fine. Loneliness had been his only company since his brother's death, and the ranch felt too big for one man to manage. Marriage had seemed less like romance and more like survival. But as the months wore on and the letters became more personal, he'd found himself imagining the sound of her voice, the way her face might soften when she smiled. A distant sound broke through his thoughts, the sharp crack of a whip and the jangle of harnesses. The stagecoach was coming. Jackson straightened, feeling a strange hollow beat in his chest. The dust cloud rose over the ridge, and the town seemed to pause. As the driver coaxed the tired horses down the last stretch of road, the coach lumbered to a stop in front of the post office, wood wheels creaking. The driver, a leathery man with a red kerchief, hopped down and tipped his hat. "Dry Creek stop," he called, his voice rough. "Who's claiming baggage?" Jackson stepped forward, his boots thudding softly in the dirt. The door of the coach swung open and then she stepped out. The first thing Jackson noticed was her size. Nora Brannigan wasn't the delicate woman he'd pictured from her letters. She was tall, easily matching his own height, and broad in the shoulders, her frame sturdy from years of labor. Her auburn hair was braided and coiled under a modest bonnet, and her face was striking, with a square jaw and freckled cheeks. She wore a simple traveling dress, its fabric dusty from miles of road, but she carried herself with quiet dignity, her gloved hands clasped around a small satchel. For a long moment Jackson could only stare. The whispers of the townsfolk turned into open gawking. Nora met his gaze without flinching. Her green eyes held something steady, something unafraid. She scanned him from hat to boots, and though she didn't smile, she gave a polite nod. "Mr. Cole," she said in a lilting Irish accent that surprised him. Her voice was rich, warm, and confident. "I reckon you're here for me." Jackson's throat felt dry. He tipped his hat. "Yes, ma'am. Welcome to Dry Creek." He offered his hand, and she shook it firmly, her grip strong enough to startle him. A few men chuckled behind him, and Jackson could feel the heat rising in his ears. The matchmaker hadn't mentioned her height, nor the way she seemed to tower over most of the men in town. The murmurs weren't kind. "She'll snap him like a twig," someone whispered. Jackson ignored it and picked up her single carpet bag. Stage was long, Nora said calmly, glancing around the dusty street. I'll be glad to sit a spell. Jackson cleared his throat. We'll ride out soon. Ranch is a half-day's ride. She nodded. I'm ready. There was no small talk, no fluttering of lashes, none of the awkward charm he'd half prepared for. Instead, she was practical, composed, and entirely unlike the shy frontier bride he'd pictured. The ride out of town was quiet. Jackson led his sturdy chestnut gelding with Nora perched behind him on the saddle, holding tight but not clinging. She rode with ease, swaying with the rhythm of the horse as though she'd done it 100 times. The sky stretched wide and endless above them, streaked with late afternoon light, and the prairie grasses rustled like whispers in the wind. Jackson rarely spoke, but he found himself stealing glances at her profile. She had a strength about her that was disarming. You expected someone smaller, she said suddenly, her voice calm, eyes fixed on the horizon. Jackson blinked. Ma'am? Your letters, she said. You wrote like a man picturing a delicate woman. I ain't delicate, Mr. Cole. I learned long ago a woman's got to be sturdy to make it in this world. He hesitated. I didn't expect much of anything, he admitted. Just someone honest. She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Honest, I can be. That was the end of it, but the weight of her words lingered in the cool air. By the time they reached the ranch, twilight had settled, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Jackson's ranch sprawled over rolling hills, dotted with cattle and framed by the jagged silhouette of distant mountains. The house stood plain but solid, its wooden walls weathered by wind and time. A lantern flickered in the window. Nora dismounted, without waiting for help, dusted off her skirts and took in the sight of her new home. She's a lonely stretch of land, she said softly, but she's beautiful. Jackson tied off the horse. She's work more than anything, but I reckon she could feel like home. Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. The kitchen was sparse but clean, the furniture plain. Jackson wasn't used to guests, let alone a wife. He set her bag by the stairs and awkwardly gestured toward the table. I'll fix us supper, he said. I'll help, she replied, immediately, unpinning her bonnet and rolling up her sleeves. Her forearms were strong, marked with faint scars, and Jackson felt a pang of curiosity. They worked side by side in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the clatter of pans. Nora moved with quiet efficiency, not needing instruction. When the stew was simmering, she sat across from him at the table, her green eyes steady. Mr. Cole, she began, her tone measured. We don't know each other, and I won't pretend I'm not different from what you expected. But I came, here for a reason. I wanted a place to belong. I can work hard and I won't run from trouble. If that suits you, we'll get along fine. Jackson studied her, the lantern light casting shadows across her face. She was blunt, strong-willed, and utterly unafraid. Something about that stirred a feeling he hadn't had in years. Respect. That suits me, he said simply. They ate in silence, the wind howling outside, rattling the shutters. After supper, Jackson stepped onto the porch to smoke, staring out into the dark fields. That's when he saw it. A lone figure on horseback at the edge of the property watching. He narrowed his eyes, hand instinctively brushing his revolver. The rider turned and vanished into the darkness. When he returned inside, Nora was cleaning dishes, humming softly. She glanced at him. Someone out there? Could be, Jackson said. Likely just a drifter. But his gut told him otherwise. In these parts, a man didn't linger on another man's land without reason. As the night deepened, the ranch house felt smaller, the wind louder. Jackson checked his rifle, locking the door. He found himself listening for every creak, every whisper of movement outside. In her room upstairs, Nora unpacked her few belongings. She pulled out a small, worn photograph of a younger version of herself, standing beside a circus tent. Her eyes lingered on it for a moment before she tucked it under her pillow. Downstairs, Jackson stared into the dying fire, haunted by the image of that lone rider. Trouble had a way of finding him, no matter how far out he built his fences, and now he had someone else to protect. Outside, beneath the blanket of stars, the land was quiet. But somewhere beyond the hills, riders moved through the night, and whispers of vengeance stirred in the dark. The loner rancher had taken a bride, and that choice would change everything. A ranch of ghosts and whispers. The sun rose pale and thin over the Wyoming plains, casting a soft, silvery light over Jackson Cole's ranch. The wind had died overnight, leaving the world in a kind of hushed stillness that was both peaceful and unsettling. Morning frost clung to the edges of the corral fence, and the smell of damp earth and livestock filled the air. From the upstairs window of the modest ranch house, Nora Brannigan stood looking out over her new home, her hands resting on the sill. She had not slept much. The bed was comfortable enough, but her mind had been restless, replaying the events of the previous day. Her first impression of Jackson Cole was that he was a man who had spent too long in silence. His voice had been low and steady, his manners stiff but courteous, and his eyes, though shadowed under the brim of his hat, had carried a weight of sorrow she recognized immediately. She had seen it before, in men and women both, the haunted look of someone who had buried too many memories. This land was beautiful, but it was lonely too. The wind seemed to carry voices from the past, and Nora wondered what had happened here to shape the man she now called husband. She had been called a mail-order bride by strangers on the road, the words carrying a hint of mockery. Yet there was nothing comical about the life that awaited her. This was no storybook romance. This was survival. She tightened the braid in her auburn hair, pulled on a wool shawl, and made her way down the narrow stairs. Jackson was already in the kitchen, pouring black coffee into a tin cup. He nodded at her without words. Nora returned, the nod slipping into the rhythm of his silence as easily as if she'd been born to it. "You're an early riser," he finally said, his voice rough from sleep. "Habit," she replied. "Years of cooking for showfolk. They like their breakfast before dawn." Jackson's brow lifted slightly, but he didn't press her for more. She had mentioned working for a circus, but he hadn't asked for details. She appreciated that. Questions had always felt like prying fingers to her. Here there was space to breathe. "Figured we'd start with the barn," he said, sliding her a plate of biscuits. "Got 2 calves, need tending, and the east fence took a beating from last week's wind." She nodded, already rising from her seat. "Show me what needs doing." Outside, the frost bit at their faces, and Nora pulled her shawl tighter. The barn stood a few hundred yards from the house, its red paint faded to a dull rust. Chickens scattered at their approach, and the smell of hay and cattle filled her lungs. She breathed it in deeply. It smelled like purpose, like hard work, like home. Jackson moved with an easy efficiency, his long strides carrying him through chores without wasted motion. He forked hay, checked the water trough, and showed her the feed bins. Nora followed suit, her strong arms lifting and hauling without complaint. She had worked hard all her life, scrubbing circus tents, cooking for crews, hauling crates of supplies. She had never been afraid of sweat or sore muscles. Jackson glanced at her more than once, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. He had expected a woman to be delicate, maybe even fragile. Nora was neither. She handled herself like a seasoned ranch hand, and he found himself quietly impressed. "You've done this before," he remarked, watching her scoop grain into a trough. "Never cattle," she said with a small smile. "But work's work. I know my way around a shovel." For the first time, Jackson almost smiled. By midday, they'd fixed a sagging section of the east fence and rounded up a stray calf that had wandered too far. Nora's skirts were streaked with mud, her hands blistered, but she felt more alive than she had in years. The wide-open prairie stretched endlessly around them, dotted with sagebrush and distant pine. In the far distance, snow-capped peaks pierced the horizon. She paused for a moment, leaning against a fence post, her breath visible in the cool air. Jackson was crouched nearby, adjusting a strand of barbed wire. He glanced up at her, following her gaze toward the mountains. "Never thought I'd see land like this," she said softly. It'll test you, he murmured, but it'll keep you honest. Nora turned her head to study him. His face was weathered, tanned from years in the sun, and his dark hair had begun to show flecks of gray at the temples. He had the look of a man carved out of this land, like he belonged to it as much as the cattle in the mountains. Do you like it? She asked, curious. Jackson hesitated. Like's not the word, he said finally. It's what I know, and it's all I've got. Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She didn't push him. The day passed in a steady rhythm of chores. By the time the sun dipped low in the sky, the air grew sharp and cold. Nora was carrying a bucket of water from the well when she noticed something unusual near the barn. A set of hoofprints, deep and fresh, led away from the corral. She crouched, frowning. Jackson, she called softly. He came over, rifle slung over his shoulder. What is it? She pointed. These weren't here this morning. Jackson's expression hardened. He knelt, tracing the prints with a gloved finger. 2 riders, he muttered. Came close. Too close. You think it's trouble? Likely. He rose, scanning the horizon. The open plains gave no sign of movement, just the whisper of wind through dry grass. That night, Jackson made sure every window was latched, every door bolted. He set his rifle by the door and sat at the kitchen table cleaning his revolver. Nora watched him from across the room, her brow furrowed. You've got enemies, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Jackson's jaw tightened. A few? Why? He met her gaze. This land's worth more than gold to some folks. I wouldn't sell. Didn't take long for them to make it personal. Nora's lips pressed into a thin line. She'd seen this sort of story before. Greedy men sniffing around like wolves, using fear and violence to take what they wanted. She'd lived her own version of it under the iron hand of a circus ringmaster who treated her like property. She reached for the teapot, her voice steady. Well, they'll find they picked the wrong ranch. Jackson studied her, curious about the steel in her tone. She didn't flinch under his gaze, and something in him shifted. Maybe this woman, this towering Irish stranger, was exactly what this ranch needed. 2 days later, the warning came. It was early morning, the sky still gray with dawn, when Jackson found it. A crude sign nailed to the fence post by the gate. It was nothing more than a scrap of wood scrawled with a single word in black paint. Leave. Jackson ripped it down, his face dark. Nora came up behind him, her eyes narrowing. Who? She asked. Clay Mercer, Jackson said, spitting the name like a curse. Him and his men been itching for this land since last spring. Nora crossed her arms. You think he'll make good on the threat? Jackson looked out over the land, his jaw set. Mercers always do. The day was tense. Jackson went about his chores with one eye on the horizon. Nora stayed close, helping with cattle, her eyes sharp. That afternoon, while Jackson fixed a broken gate, she heard something. A faint rustle in the hayloft of the barn. She froze, hand instinctively going to the knife she kept in her apron pocket. Jackson, she whispered. He turned, rifle in hand, and followed her gaze upward. Stay here, he murmured. He moved toward the barn slowly, every step careful. Nora's heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly a shadow darted from the loft, a man in a dust-stained coat, jumping to the ground with a grunt. Jackson fired a warning shot, the crack echoing across the plains. The man scrambled to his horse, vaulting into the saddle. Nora ran forward without thinking, grabbing a pitchfork and swinging it at the rider as he tried to bolt past her. The tines caught his coat, ripping fabric. The man cursed, lashing out with his boot, but she ducked and struck again, this time connecting with his leg. He yelped and spurred his horse, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Jackson ran up, eyes wide. You could have been killed, he growled. He was trespassing, Nora said fiercely, her cheeks flushed. I wasn't about to let him ride off, without a fight. Jackson stared at her for a moment, then let out a slow breath. You're something else, he muttered. Is that good or bad? She asked, arching a brow. He almost smiled. Good. That night, Jackson set extra locks on the doors. Nora sat by the fire, rubbing her sore arms, her mind racing. She had always been strong, but she had rarely been allowed to show it. In the circus, her size had made her a curiosity. Here it made her a partner. She glanced at Jackson, who was cleaning his rifle again. "You think Mercer will come back?" Jackson nodded grimly. "Oh, he'll come back. But next time he won't send just one man to snoop." Nora met his gaze steadily. "Then we'll be ready." For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with something unspoken. Jackson was not used to sharing his home, his fears, or his plans. But as he looked at the tall, stubborn woman before him, he felt something unexpected. Safety. Later that night, as Nora lay in bed, she heard the wind moaning through the eaves. The land seemed restless, like it was holding its breath. She reached under her pillow for the photograph she had hidden there. Her younger self stared back at her, softer, smaller, smiling beside a man in a top hat. She traced the man's face with her thumb, her jaw tightening. The past had followed her to Wyoming, just as it had followed Jackson, and she knew deep in her bones that their enemies would not be content to leave them in peace. The ranch was more than a stretch of land. It was a battleground. And for the first time in her life, Nora felt ready to fight for something worth keeping. Winter comes for the rancher. The first snow arrived with no warning. One morning, Nora awoke to find the world outside her window blanketed in white. The Wyoming plains transformed into a silent ocean of frost and drifting snow. The sky was a low, gray ceiling pressing against the earth, and the air was so cold it made her lungs ache when she drew in a breath. She stood there in her nightdress, her hand resting on the window frame, and for a moment, she felt like a child again, back in Ireland, staring out at winter storms from a tiny cottage window. Only this was no cottage, and this land was far less forgiving. Downstairs, she could already hear Jackson moving about, his boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. The smell of coffee drifted upward, mixing with the scent of wood smoke from the stove. She dressed quickly, pulling on her thickest dress, wrapping herself in a shawl, and braiding her long auburn hair tight against her head. The chill in the air seeped through the walls, settling into her bones as she descended the stairs. Jackson was at the table, his hat pushed back on his head, a steaming mug in his calloused hands. He looked up at her as she entered, his expression unreadable, but his eyes, those dark, guarded eyes, softened just a little. "Storm's comin'," he said, his voice low and gravelly from lack of sleep. "This isn't the storm?" Nora asked, glancing out the window at the white landscape. "No," Jackson said, shaking his head. "This is just the start." He stood, reaching for his coat. "We need to bring the cattle in closer to the barn, stack more wood inside, and make sure every door and shutter's tight. When a real blizzard hits out here, you can't see 3 feet in front of you, and it'll kill a man if he's caught in it too long." Nora nodded, her face calm but determined. "Tell me what to do." They worked tirelessly as the day wore on, the bitter wind biting their faces until their cheeks were raw. Jackson moved with quiet efficiency, gathering cattle, hammering boards, over loose windows, hauling hay into the barn. Nora matched his pace step for step, her strong arms lifting bales of hay, her boots crunching through snow that grew deeper with every passing hour. At one point, as she wrestled with a stubborn gate frozen shut, she heard him call out to her. "You're tougher than most men I know," Jackson said, a rare smile tugging at his lips as he swung the gate open for her. She smirked, breath puffing in white clouds. "I've had to be." He didn't ask why, but his gaze lingered on her, a moment longer than usual, as though he wanted to. By nightfall, the storm was upon them. The wind howled like a living creature, battering the small ranch house and sending loose snow swirling through every crack and crevice. Jackson had stacked wood by the fire, secured every shutter, and double-checked the locks on the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stew simmering over the fire, but even that comforting smell couldn't drown out the eerie moan of the wind. Nora sat by the window, staring into the swirling white chaos beyond. "It feels like the world's gone," she murmured softly. Jackson glanced up from where he was oiling his rifle. "Sometimes it does." She turned to him, her eyes curious. "You've seen storms like this before?" "Plenty." He set the rifle aside and leaned back in his chair, his expression distant. "Storms like this'll test a man's patience, test his will, but they pass, eventually." His tone was steady, but there was a heaviness behind his words, a shadow that drew Nora's attention. She studied him for a long moment, then said softly, "You've been through worse than storms, haven't you?" Jackson's jaw tightened. He didn't answer immediately, and she thought he might brush her off. But then he sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "My family had a ranch farther east near the Black Hills," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "I was the youngest of 3 boys. My pa worked himself to the bone trying to build something out there. We had some good years. Then, one night, a gang rode through. Cattle rustlers out for blood as much as money. They torched the place, shot my pa and brothers. I was barely 20, and somehow I made it out alive." Nora's breath caught. "I'm so sorry." Jackson shook his head. "It was a long time ago. After that I came west, bought this land and figured I'd spend the rest of my life alone. Figured it was easier that way, no one else to lose." The firelight flickered over his scarred cheek, deepening the shadows under his eyes. Nora's heart ached at the loneliness in his voice. She knew that loneliness well. It had been her own companion for years. "I know what it's like to run," she said softly, surprising herself. "I know what it's like to lose everything and start over." Jackson looked at her, something flickering in his dark gaze. "What were you running from?" For a moment she said nothing. She wasn't used to talking about her past, but here, in the warm glow of the fire while the storm screamed outside, she felt strangely safe. "I worked for a traveling circus," she said slowly. "I was a cook mostly, sometimes helped with the animals, mended costumes. The man who ran it, he wasn't kind. He owned people the way some folks own horses. He liked to remind us of that too. I stayed as long as I could because I didn't have anywhere else to go. But one day," she paused, her hand tightening around the arm of her chair. "One day, I decided I'd rather die on the road than spend another day there. So I ran, came here." Jackson's eyes softened, and for a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "He after you?" She nodded once. "I reckon he is." The crackle of the fire filled the silence between them. 2 broken souls, both chased by ghosts, sitting together in a small house in the middle of a storm. The next morning the blizzard had grown worse. Snow piled high against the doors and the windows were covered in white frost. Jackson had to shove hard against the front door to open it even an inch, only to be met with a wall of snow. "We're snowed in," he muttered, shutting the door quickly to keep the wind from tearing through the house. Nora stood beside him, her arms crossed, watching the storm batter the world outside. How long do these storms usually last? Could be a few days. Could be a week. She raised an eyebrow. "A week?" "Best settle in," he said, and there was a trace of humor in his voice for the first time since she'd met him. Over the next 2 days, they fell into a strange rhythm. Trapped together in the little house, they worked side by side, splitting kindling, cooking simple meals, melting snow for water, and checking the livestock when the weather allowed brief breaks. The isolation forced a kind of closeness neither of them had expected. Jackson wasn't much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. Nora, in turn, found herself telling stories she hadn't shared with anyone in years. Memories of her childhood in Ireland, the smell of salt water and peat fires, her mother's laughter before illness took her away. Jackson listened quietly, occasionally offering a dry remark or a gentle question that revealed his interest. One evening, as the storm roared outside, they sat by the fire again, the air thick with warmth and wood smoke. Nora mended one of Jackson's shirts, her needle glinting in the firelight. He watched her hands for a moment, then said softly, "You're good with that." "Years of practice," she replied with a small smile. Can't afford to waste clothes when you don't know where your next ones are coming from. Jackson nodded, his gaze lingering on her face. He wanted to say something else, something he couldn't quite put into words, but before he could speak, a sound outside caught his attention. He set down his coffee and rose, crossing to the window. Peering through the frost-covered glass, he saw movement in the snow, a dark shape moving low against the wind. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for Nora to stay put. But she didn't. She rose quickly, pulling on her coat, her green eyes sharp. "What is it?" "Don't know," he muttered. "Could be one of Mercer's men, could be an animal." He unlatched the door and a blast of icy wind tore into the house. Snow whipped around them as they stepped out into the storm, Jackson in the lead, rifle at the ready. The dark shape moved again, closer this time, and then Nora heard it. A soft, pitiful sound. A cry. "It's a horse," she said, rushing forward. They found the animal half buried in snow, shivering violently. Its saddle was torn and there was no rider in sight. Jackson knelt, checking the horse's flank. "This horse belongs to Mercer's gang," he said grimly, recognizing the brand. "Then where's its rider?" Jackson scanned the white landscape, but visibility was near zero. "Dead, maybe, or watching us." They managed to coax the horse back to the barn, giving it shelter from the storm. Jackson's expression was grim as they returned inside. "They're out there," he said quietly, his voice hard. "Even in this storm, they're watching." Nora tightened her shawl around her shoulders. "Then let them watch," she said fiercely. "They'll see we're not afraid." Jackson looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his gaze. "You're something else, Nora Brannigan." She met his eyes steadily. "So are you, Jackson Cole." For a long moment, the world outside disappeared. The storm, the enemies, the fear. There was only the firelight, the soft crackle of wood, and the unspoken bond growing stronger between them. The blizzard raged on for 3 more days, isolating them completely from the outside world. Yet within that isolation, something shifted between Jackson and Nora. The silence between them grew warm instead of heavy, and each shared glance carried more meaning than words could hold. But as the storm began to break, revealing a pale blue sky and a world buried in snowdrifts, both of them knew this fragile peace would not last. Somewhere beyond the hills, Clay Mercer's men were regrouping, and the storm had only bought them time. For now, though, the ranch stood like a fortress of warmth in the frozen wilderness, and for the first time in many years, Jackson Cole didn't feel entirely alone, and, for Nora Brannigan, that was more dangerous than any outlaw, because love was its own kind of risk. Gunsmoke and confessions. The sound of the wind howling across the Wyoming plains that evening was like the cry of some wounded creature, trapped and angry. It whipped through the open spaces between the ranch buildings, rattling loose boards and flinging up clouds of dust as if nature itself had joined the growing tension that hung heavy over the Cole homestead. The air smelled faintly of snow and wood smoke, the first taste of the hard winter creeping closer. Inside the main house, the fire roared, but warmth alone could not drive away the unease that had settled over Jackson and Nora. Jackson sat at the table, his brow furrowed, running a whetstone carefully along the edge of his knife. The scraping sound was rhythmic, a slow and deliberate motion that spoke more of nervous energy than necessity. Across from him, Nora mended a shirt with steady hands, but her gaze kept flicking to the window, where the darkening sky pressed against the glass. Something was coming. She felt it in her bones, a heaviness she hadn't felt since the days when she'd hidden in circus tents, listening for the footsteps of a man who'd vowed to break her spirit. "Town's been whisperin'," Jackson finally said, his voice low and gruff, breaking the heavy silence. "Sheriff Tanner rode by this afternoon. Told me Mercer's boy's been seen at Dead Horse Ridge." He looked up, meeting her eyes. His gray gaze was like steel, sharp but tired, carrying the weight of years spent alone. "That's only a day's ride out." Nora's jaw tightened, her needle pausing mid-stitch. "Then we'd best be ready. They're not the type to ride all this way just to tip their hats," he smirked grimly. "No, they ain't." The fire crackled louder as if emphasizing the point, casting their faces in flickering light. The storm outside pressed against the house with increasing ferocity, wind moaning through the cracks like a warning. Later that night, Jackson moved through the barn, lantern in hand, checking the horses and livestock. His boots crunched on the hay-strewn floor and his breath clouded in the chill air. The animals were restless, shifting and snorting, their ears flicking nervously. He patted his chestnut gelding, murmuring soothing words, but his own nerves were strung tight. When he stepped back outside, lantern swinging, the moon had slipped behind clouds, plunging the prairie into darkness. That's when he heard it. A faint sound, far off but distinct. Hoofbeats. Many of them. He froze, narrowing his eyes toward the horizon. Nothing but blackness met his gaze, but his gut told him Mercer's gang wasn't far. Jackson extinguished the lantern and moved silently back toward the house, his heart pounding. Nora was already at the door, rifle in hand, as if she'd sensed him coming. "They're out there, ain't they?" she whispered. He nodded. "We ain't got long." The first shots rang out not long after midnight. A bullet slammed into the barn door with a deafening crack, splinters flying. Jackson shoved Nora down behind the porch rail as another shot shattered a window. "Stay low," he barked, grabbing his Winchester and firing a warning shot into the darkness. The attackers whooped and hollered, their voices carrying on the wind. Mercer's men. The gang that had been tormenting this land for years, bleeding ranchers dry, burning homesteads, killing without remorse. Jackson had crossed them once, refusing to sell them grazing rights. They'd marked him for it. Now, they'd come to settle the score. Nora crouched by the porch column, her massive frame hunched low, but her hands were steady as she loaded her rifle with practiced ease. When Jackson leaned to fire again, she covered him, her shot hitting one of the men on horseback, sending him tumbling. "Nice shooting," Jackson muttered, glancing at her. "Don't sound so surprised," she said grimly, cocking the lever and firing again. The gunfight raged, the night alive with flashes of muzzle fire and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Horses screamed and men cursed as bullets cracked through the air. Jackson felt time slow around him, every sense sharpened. The scrape of his trigger finger, the sharp kick of the rifle. Nora's breath quick and steady beside him. She was a force of nature, unflinching, her broad shoulders making her silhouette seem like a wall of protection. After what felt like hours, the sound of galloping hooves faded into the distance. The gang had retreated, at least for now. Jackson exhaled heavily, sweat mingling with the chill of the night air. Nora stood scanning the darkness with fierce determination. "They'll be back," she said. "I know." He reached for her hand briefly, an instinct he didn't quite understand, but she didn't pull away. For a moment their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they faced together. The next morning Sheriff Tanner arrived, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the bullet holes and shattered glass. "Mercer's getting bold," Tanner said, spitting into the dirt. "He won't quit till you're either dead or run off this land, Cole." Jackson crossed his arms. "Ain't running." Tanner's gaze shifted to Nora, and something like admiration flickered there. "Heard you stood your ground." "I'll do it again," she said firmly. The sheriff nodded. "Good. You're gonna need every ounce of grit you got." That evening, as the two sat in silence before the fire, Nora finally broke the heavy quiet. "Jackson, there's something I need to tell you," she said softly, her voice trembling. He looked up, surprised by her tone. "I wasn't just a cook for the circus," she began, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I was part of the act. They called me the Giantess of Galway. Folks paid to gawk at me, but that wasn't the worst of it. The man who ran the show, Callahan, he treated me like property. When I escaped, he put a price on my head. He'll come looking one day." Jackson's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. "A bounty," she nodded, ashamed. "I didn't mean to bring danger to your door." He leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "Nora, you didn't bring danger. Danger finds folks like us no matter where we go. But I'll tell you this. No. Man's gonna take you from this ranch, not while I'm breathing." For the first time, Nora's stoic composure cracked, tears welling in her eyes. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not just a hardened loner, but a man willing to fight for her. That realization stirred something deep within her, something she'd long buried under layers of shame and fear. Outside, the wind howled again, rattling the windows. The night carried with it an ominous promise. The storm was far from over. The woman who rode like thunder. The dawn came slow and gray, the sky a sheet of bruised clouds that hung heavy over the Wyoming prairie. The land felt different that morning, quieter somehow, like the world was holding its breath. Jackson Cole stood on his porch with his hat low over his eyes, the barrel of his Winchester resting against his shoulder. His gaze swept across the rolling hills, each shadow and dip scrutinized. Something about the silence unsettled him. This wasn't the peaceful calm of a normal morning. This was the stillness before a storm. Inside, Nora was already awake, her large hands deftly braiding her long auburn hair with practiced efficiency. She'd been on edge all night, half expecting Mercer's gang to come back with reinforcements. Instead, the night had passed without incident, leaving her nerves frayed and taut. She had faced plenty of danger in her life, the cruelty of Callahan and his circus, drunken men with wandering hands, nights spent hiding in wagons and barns. But this was different. This was war on a man's home, and the thought of someone like Mercer putting his hands on Jackson or burning his land made something primal awaken in her chest. She stepped out onto the porch, her rifle slung over her shoulder. Jackson turned his head slightly, and for a moment his expression softened. "You braid that hair every morning like you're getting ready for a Sunday picnic," he said quietly. "Old habit," she replied, her voice calm but tired. "Keeps it out of my way." He gave a grunt of approval, though his eyes never left the horizon. Then it happened. The sound of galloping hooves shattered the eerie stillness. Both of them tensed instantly, rifles raised. From beyond the ridge, a lone horse barreled toward the ranch, its rider slumped forward. It wasn't an enemy, at least not one they recognized. As the rider drew closer, Jackson recognized him. Luke Miller, a ranch hand from the neighboring homestead. Jackson sprinted forward as Luke slid from the saddle, blood staining his shirt. He collapsed into Jackson's arms, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They took him," Luke choked out. Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Who?" "Sheriff Tanner. Mercer's boys ambushed us, dragged him off toward Pine Hollow." Nora's blood ran cold. "Why would they take the sheriff?" Luke spat blood into the dirt, his voice breaking. "To send a message," said Coles next. By the time Jackson carried Luke inside and laid him on the couch, Nora was already strapping a revolver to her hip and double-checking her ammunition. Her movements were fast, precise, fueled by a steady anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You ain't riding with me," Jackson said sharply, grabbing his saddlebag. "I'll get Tanner back." She froze mid-motion, her green eyes flashing. "You think I'm letting you ride out there alone against Mercer's gang?" "Not letting you put yourself in that kind of danger," he snapped back. Her laugh was bitter, humorless. "Jackson Cole, I've been stared at, spat on, and beaten half to death for being who I am. I've stared down men meaner than Mercer and lived to tell it. You think I'm going to sit here and knit while you ride out there to die? Not a chance." Jackson opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the fire in her eyes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was telling him she was coming. He sighed heavily and muttered something under his breath about stubborn women. But his heart twisted. At the sight of her determination, truth was, he was grateful she was by his side. They rode hard through the biting wind, the sky darkening with thick storm clouds. The Wyoming prairie stretched out around them like a vast empty sea, the smell of snow sharp in the air. Nora rode, a massive black mare, a horse as large and sturdy as she was. She rode with surprising grace, her long legs steady in the stirrups, her back straight. Jackson couldn't help but glance at her from time to time, struck by the image she cut against the wild landscape. A towering woman with fire in her eyes, moving like she belonged out here in this untamed world. When they reached Pine Hollow, they dismounted in silence, tying their horses in a grove of scrub pine. The hollow itself was a rocky ravine with a half-collapsed mining shack near the bottom. Smoke rose faintly from a campfire below. Through the scope of his rifle, Jackson spotted at least 6 men milling around, one of them clearly guarding a bound and bloodied Sheriff Tanner. 6, maybe more, Jackson whispered. Could be a couple hid in the shack. Nora crouched, beside him, her massive hand resting on her rifle stock. We split their attention. You circle wide, take out the man near the horses. I'll draw fire from the shack. He turned to her sharply. That's suicide. No, she said firmly. It's a distraction, I can handle it, you get Tanner out. Their eyes locked, an unspoken trust passing between them. Jackson knew arguing would waste time they didn't have. He gave a single nod. The first shot cracked through the hollow like a whip, echoing off the rocky walls. One of Mercer's men crumpled instantly, and chaos erupted. Nora rose from cover like a storm breaking over the hills, her rifle steady as she advanced with deliberate precision. Her imposing figure made her an easy target, and bullets whistled past her, but she didn't flinch. She moved with the calm, terrifying confidence of someone who had stared down danger before. Jackson used the distraction to slip through the brush, his movements quick and silent. He reached the sheriff's side, cutting through the ropes with his hunting knife. Can you walk? He whispered. Tanner grimaced, but nodded. Barely. Jackson slung the sheriff's arm over his shoulder and began dragging him toward the tree line. Behind them, Nora's voice rang out, deep and commanding. Come on, boys. You'll have to do better than that if you're going to kill me. Jackson glanced over his shoulder to see her standing like a fortress, firing steadily as she moved from cover to cover. She wasn't just holding her own. She was terrifying them. Mercer's men had expected an easy kill. Instead, they were facing a woman who seemed carved from stone, a living legend in the making. By the time Jackson and Tanner reached the horses, Nora was running low on ammunition. She fired her last shot and then bolted toward the tree line, bullets biting at her heels. Jackson covered her with his rifle, dropping a man who came too close. She dove behind a log beside him, breathless but grinning fiercely. Got the sheriff, Jackson panted. Good, she replied, loading her revolver. Now let's get out of here. They mounted up quickly, Jackson hauling Tanner onto his own horse. Nora rode behind, firing a few parting shots as they galloped out of the hollow. The gang gave chase briefly, but the approaching snowstorm worked in their favor, swallowing them in a curtain of white. Hours later, they stumbled back into the ranch yard, exhausted but alive. Tanner was safe, though battered. Jackson helped him inside, then turned to Nora. She was leaning against the porch rail, her breath fogging in the frigid air, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline. You saved us all tonight, he said, quietly. She looked at him, startled by the weight in his voice. I just did what needed doing. No, he said, stepping closer. You did more than that. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm raged around them, wind howling, through the dark. But in that moment, there was a warmth between them that had nothing to do with the fire inside. Jackson reached up, gently brushing a strand of wet hair from her cheek, his touch hesitant but tender. Reckon I've been waiting a long time for someone like you, he murmured. Nora's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She'd never thought of herself as a woman someone would wait for. She'd been a spectacle, a joke, a runaway. Yet here he was, looking at her like she was the most remarkable thing he'd ever seen. For the first time since stepping off that wagon, she allowed herself to believe she might finally be home. But the snowstorm outside whispered a dark truth neither of them could ignore. Mercer wouldn't forgive this humiliation. And Callahan, the man who'd owned her, would come calling sooner or later. Their battles were only beginning. The woman who wouldn't bow. The blizzard raged for 2 long days, the wind howling like a chorus of wolves across the Wyoming plains. Snow piled high against the ranch house, and the Cole homestead became a fortress buried beneath white silence. Inside, the warmth of the fire cast soft light across the room, but there was no mistaking the tension that hung thick in the air. Jackson sat at the kitchen table cleaning his rifle, his jaw tight, his movements precise. Nora sat nearby, sewing a tear in her heavy coat, her large hands surprisingly delicate as they threaded the needle. The storm outside might have held Mercer's gang at bay, but both of them knew it wouldn't last forever. Sheriff Tanner lay on the couch, his bandages fresh and his breathing even, though the bruises on his face told the story of Mercer's cruelty. The man was tough, but even he had admitted that Mercer wouldn't forgive being humiliated. The outlaw would gather more men, and this time he'd bring hell with him. Nora's mind wasn't just on Mercer. She hadn't told Jackson everything about Callahan, not really. The man she'd escaped wasn't just a carnival owner. He was a tyrant, a businessman with dangerous connections, a man who'd built his fortune turning people like her into curiosities and commodities. When she'd run, she knew he wouldn't let her go quietly. The only reason she'd stayed hidden this long was because she'd been moving constantly, but she wasn't running anymore, and that terrified her more than any gunfight. Staying here on this ranch with this man she was beginning to care for meant Callahan had a place to find her, and if he came, he wouldn't come alone. Jackson caught her staring at the fire, her needle paused mid-stitch. "You're thinking loud," he said softly, his voice breaking through the crackle of the flames. She blinked, then gave a small smile. "Old habit." "Something on your mind?" he asked, setting his rifle aside. Nora hesitated. She'd been holding this truth in for weeks, but if they were going to fight for their lives, he deserved to know. "His name's Callahan," she said finally, her voice low. "I worked for him, if you can call it work. He ran a traveling circus. She swallowed hard, memories threatening to choke her. "He bought me from my folks when I was 14. Said a girl my size was worth something to him. For years I was just a thing to be looked at, laughed at. If I fought back, I got the whip. If I ran, they'd drag me back." Jackson's eyes darkened, his fists curling. "And you escaped?" "2 years ago," she said, staring into the fire. "He's been looking for me ever since. I reckon Mercer's gang is one thing, but Callahan, he's worse. He don't just take revenge, he owns it." Jackson rose from his chair and crossed the room in 3 long strides. He crouched in front of her, taking her large hands gently in his. "You're safe here," he said firmly. "As long as I'm breathing, no man lays a hand on you again." Her throat tightened, tears threatening to spill. No one had ever said words like that to her, not and meant them. She nodded once, then squeezed his hands back, the spark of resolve rekindled in her chest. The snow stopped falling on the 3rd night, leaving behind a glittering white world under a pale moon. The stillness was eerie, too quiet. Jackson felt it in his bones before he even heard the sound, the distant thunder of hooves. "They're here," he murmured, grabbing his rifle. Nora was already on her feet, strapping on her gun belt. Her heart pounded as she glanced out the window. Lanterns flickered in the darkness, moving like a swarm of fireflies. Mercer had come, and he hadn't come alone. The first gunshot shattered the night, splintering a fence post near the barn. Jackson threw open the door, taking cover behind the porch rail as bullets whizzed through the yard. Nora crouched beside him, her revolver steady, her breath slow. "Mercer!" Jackson bellowed into the darkness. "You got the guts to come face me yourself?" A chilling laugh echoed across the snow. "Why would I, Cole? You're a dead man, already. And that big red-haired freak with you? She's worth a pretty penny to a man I know." Nora's blood froze. Callahan. And then she saw him, stepping out of the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. Callahan was older now, but his smile hadn't changed. Cold, sharp, cruel. He held himself like a man who owned everything he touched. "Hello, pet," he called, his voice carrying over the wind. "Thought you could hide from me?" Something inside Nora snapped. She'd spent years fearing this man, letting his shadow define her. But she wasn't that girl anymore, not after weeks of working this land, defending it, and standing beside Jackson. She rose from cover, her towering form a silhouette against the moonlit snow. "I ain't your pet," she growled, her voice like thunder rolling over the hills. "And I ain't hiding no more," Callahan sneered. Shoot her in the leg, I want her alive. But Nora had already moved. She fired her revolver with deadly precision, dropping the first man before he even raised his gun. Jackson followed suit, the roar of his Winchester cracking through the night. Chaos erupted. The battle was fierce and fast, the snowy yard lit by muzzle flashes and flying sparks. Nora moved with terrifying power, reloading her revolver with calm efficiency as she advanced. A man lunged at her with a knife, but she swung, her rifle like a club sending him sprawling into the snow. Jackson covered her back, his shots clean and ruthless. Callahan shouted orders from the shadows, but one by one, his men fell. Nora's sheer size and skill made her a force of nature. She wasn't just surviving, she was hunting them. For the first time in her life, she saw fear in Callahan's eyes. When the dust settled, Mercer lay dead in the snow, his gun still, clutched in his hand. The few surviving outlaws fled into the darkness. Only Callahan remained, his pistol shaking in his hand as he faced Nora. "You wouldn't," he hissed, his voice cracking. "You're mine. You've always been mine." Nora leveled her revolver at him, her breath steady. Not anymore. The shot rang out, echoing through the hollow night. Callahan fell, his blood staining the snow black under the moonlight. The world was quiet again. Jackson lowered his rifle, breathing hard, and turned to see Nora standing tall, her shoulders squared, her eyes fierce and unflinching. She'd killed the man who had haunted her dreams for over a decade. And for the first time in her life, she was free. He crossed the yard, pulling her into his arms. She stiffened at first, unused to being held, but then she melted into him, trembling as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "You're safe now." "No," she murmured, her voice breaking. "We're safe now." The wind howled softly around them, carrying away the scent of gunpowder and blood. Inside the warm glow of the ranch house, Sheriff Tanner stirred awake, alive because of her. And somewhere deep in Nora's heart, a truth blossomed. She wasn't just a sideshow attraction or a woman on the run anymore. She was a protector, a fighter, a partner. When Jackson finally pulled back to look at her, his rough hand cupping her cheek, there was no fear or pity in his gaze. Only pride and something deeper, something she'd only ever dreamed of. "You belong here," he said softly, and for the first time Nora believed it.